So, welcome everyone to the first in our new series of CAQDAS webinars, which are organised by the CAQDAS Networking Project, which is based in the Department of Sociology at the University of Surrey. I'm Christina Silva, and I'm joined today by my colleague Sarah Bullock in hosting this event. Before we get started, just a quick reminder that you can find out more about us from our website. And if you're interested in our history, there's a short video on our YouTube playlist, which you should all have got a link to when you registered for today's session. And we'll give that out again at the end so that you can access it if you haven't done so already. As you can see, we provide different training options in the use of a range of CAQDAS packages that are available for qualitative and mixed methods analysis. And we're currently providing all of these online, but hopefully soon we'll be able to get back to offering some of them in person. There's also lots of resources on our website which you may find useful, including reviews of different tools, advice on planning for software use, and other resources arising from our research and experiences. Today, though, we're really excited to be launching our webinar series, a new endeavour for us here. There are 4 streams, and today we're starting off with a webinar that actually straddles the awareness raising and the methodological streams. You can see on the right other webinars we've scheduled up to the end of this year. These are filling up pretty fast already, so if you'd like to attend one of those, do register soon. Again, we'll provide the relevant links at the end of this session. So I have great pleasure in welcoming Professor Trena Paulus from East Tennessee State University and Associate Professor Jessica Nina Lester from Indiana University. Both are incredibly experienced qualitative researchers, methodologists, and also teachers, and they have particular expertise in the use of digital tools for undertaking qualitative research. Today, they're going to share with us some of those insights in a critical appraisal of the role that digital tools and spaces play across the whole of the qualitative research process. Their book on the topic is coming out really soon, and it's already available to pre-order from the Sage Publications website. It's the first ever book that guides readers in the creation of a comprehensive digital workflow for designing and implementing research in what is becoming an increasingly digital world. And of course, in the current global situation, its publication couldn't be more timely. There's a lot of participants here today, so we'd like to encourage you to post any questions that you have in the Q&A area as they occur to you during the webinar. We'll be collating them along the way, and Sarah will be putting them to Jessica and Trena at the end of their talk, which is going to take approximately 45 minutes. Any questions that they don't have the time to answer in the session live today, we'll put to them afterwards, and we'll include their answers when we send you the link to the webinar recording. So, without further ado, I have great pleasure to pass over to Jessica, who's going to begin.
Hello, everyone, and thank you to the CAQDAS Networking Project for the invitation to share with you all today. Just a bit about myself. I'm Jessica Lester. I'm an associate professor in inquiry methodology, which is the research methodology program at Indiana University, located in Bloomington, Indiana, in the US. My research area and teaching focus is broadly in the domain of qualitative methodologies and methods, with a particular interest in the area of discourse and conversation analysis. Much of my work is positioned really at the intersection of critical disability studies, qualitative research, and mental health. I also engage in qualitative methodological work around broader concerns such as digital tools and digital spaces in qualitative research. And more recently, I've been exploring the use of shared data sets as well. Trena?
Hello, everyone, and thanks for the invitation to be here today. I'm Trena Paulus, and I'm a professor and the director of undergraduate research and creative activity at East Tennessee University here in Johnson City, Tennessee. My main methodological interest is in research technologies, broadly speaking, and in part that comes from my background in instructional design. And I'm specifically interested in developing methods for analyzing online conversations. I started doing that back in the late 1990s when the internet sort of impacted university courses when we first started going online, which of course we have a lot more of that happening these days. Like Jessica, I use primarily language-based methods like discourse, conversation, and narrative analysis. And Right now, I am working with the Quillen College of Medicine studying communication skills for health professionals via video-based analysis using conversation analysis methods. And we appreciate the chance today to share some of our new ideas and new thinking around this topic, really for the first time in a public space.
So over the last, it's been now 10 years, as Trena mentioned, we've been collaborating on practices and considerations specifically related to digital tools and spaces in qualitative research. So to begin, I'm going to share a little bit about how our collaborative work has grown over the last decade specifically. And then I'll be pointing to some of the shifts that are evidenced in the publication of our newest book, as was mentioned, is entitled Doing Qualitative Research in the Digital World. So in the years since our first book was published, we've had a lot of transition in our thinking. So just to offer a little bit of a backstory, in 2014, Trena, myself, as well as our UK-based colleague, Paul Dempster, collaborated in writing our first book on this topic. Our first book was titled Digital Tools for Qualitative Research, and that was published in the UK by Sage. So we wrote about the idea of using digital tools, and we used the phrase across the research process. And at the time, we were really relatively new researchers learning about available technologies that could possibly support our qualitative work. And as well, we were hoping that our learning could help us support the work of our many graduate students and colleagues who were interested in developing skill sets in these areas. So for both Trena and myself, it was really our graduate students, and it really still is, who were driving our study of new technologies and their potential intersection with qualitative research practices. They were the ones that came to us with new ideas, new skills, greater familiarity, at least compared to us, even with what was out there. And in many ways, our first book offered this first pass at thinking about how to just use digital tools, again, across the qualitative research process. We wrote relatively little about methodology in our first book, or even about how technologies might shape methodology and vice versa. So indeed, there was a notable gap in the methodological literature that we were pointing to in the first book. There really had been a singular focus on digital tools as equating to qualitative data analysis software, and relatively little else had been considered. So we felt like uniquely we were arguing for envisioning tools as pervading the entirety of the qualitative research process, including but not exclusive to qualitative data analysis software. So since our first book came out, we've had the privilege of teaching special topics courses at our respective institutions, and we've also organized and participated in a number of panels and special interest groups at conferences, and given talks and published really on this topic of digital tools and qualitative research. And with this has come a great deal of feedback from students and colleagues. In addition to that, during this process, we transitioned from Sage in the UK to Sage in the US, and really used the feedback to write a revised and essentially a reimagined new book. So it's certainly not a second edition in the traditional sense. Just as technology has evolved tremendously since 2014, so has our thinking on this topic. So in our new book, we foreground qualitative research design, and to some extent, we background the technological landscape, while at the same time, we note throughout our realization that the two are inseparable. The material world of digital tools and the social world of human activity really cannot be neatly teased apart. So as part of this rethinking, we also expanded our original notion of digital tools into the more comprehensive notion of digital world to encompass not only tools, but also spaces. So for us, this expansion has come alongside our recognition of the importance of engaging in what we've come to call really a critical appraisal of how the adoption of new technologies is necessary and how new technologies really can transform our research practice. But rather than thinking about the use of digital tools across the research process, we offer this idea of developing a digital research workflow. a term actually that our students have used. So with this overview of some of the core distinctions between our two books on these topics, I'm going to offer just a general map of where we're going to head today in our talk. So first, I'm going to be sharing a little bit about our thinking around how methodology is always already shaped by the historical moment in which it comes to be, and how our use of digital tools and engagement in the digital world as qualitative researchers is really no exception to this. And then second, I'll briefly share some of the critiques and feedback that we received around the 2014 book, and specifically the way that we conceptualized and theorized, or perhaps better put, didn't theorize digital tools in our first book. So that will lead me to talk a little bit about the way in this new book that we center the importance of theorizing technology, and we'll illustrate how we invite qualitative researchers to do this. So Trena will then be sharing how this theorization has spurred us to engage in the reflexive use of digital tools and in engagement in the digital world. So to speak to this, she's going to offer a really rich, thick, developed example. And then finally, she'll conclude by offering some understandings of how to move this way of thinking about digital tools and digital spaces really forward for us as qualitative researchers and as a qualitative community as well. So as you may know, there's a lot going on in the United States, which is where we are at, and of course in the larger world as well. Over the last few months, many qualitative researchers, perhaps many of you as well, have seen our research shut down in some cases. We've also been, in many cases, required to rethink how to study human meaning making in digital spaces, or with the support of digital tools, and in some cases for the very first time. For many, turning towards digital tools and spaces have become really the only option for moving forward, given the pandemic, and some scholars have begun to write and think about how this historical moment may very well shape how we envision the very doing of qualitative research as we move forward. So of course, the idea of history as shaping methodology is not new to us as a qualitative community. Methodology is, as we know, in fact, a historical artifact. It's always evolving, shifting, and hopefully responsive to the moment and context wherein it is being leveraged. And of course, it is shaped, or perhaps it should be shaped, also by the communities and people who participate in our research. So indeed, the present moment in history is remaking our methodologies and our technologies, and the two are always intersecting, always intermingled. We feel that now more than ever, there really are important consequences and outcomes to our research practices. We certainly need sound qualitative research, research that engages in socially just participatory methods is needed now more than ever. Methods that turn toward doing research with, not on people to support others, and answering questions that matter to them and to their communities. So in this historical moment, we know as we lean into lessons from the past, that qualitative methodologies are and certainly will change, responding to the present moment. And this response, we believe, and we point to in our new book, really intersects with technologies in really productive and generative ways, but not neutral ways. In the realm of research, as in social life more generally, technology is always fraught with real consequences, political consequences. There are inequitable access to technologies. These are realities we can't escape when thinking about technologies at the intersection of qualitative research. Some of these real consequences are what we'll be thinking with you about today, as related, of course, to qualitative research. But to move us forward, we have come to see the importance of really starting our thinking about and with technologies, with theorizing technology itself. So that's where we're going to start today. So while in our first book, we really skipped over this, or at best skimmed past it, if you're being generous in your description of what we did, now we are arguing that theorizing technologies is a really critical starting point, also a generative and useful one. So how can we think about theorizing technology? Well, if you look at the literature around technology and qualitative research over the last several years, you might conclude that qualitative researchers traditionally have adhered to a view of technological determinism. This is the view that humans are passive and that they must adapt to changes that technology imperatives presumably force upon them. This is a really popularized view, and quite common examples of this can be heard in statements such as, everyone says I should use software, so my study is more rigorous, so I guess I have to. So this implicit view of technology is one that often assumes that the intrinsically best, most efficient technology will be adopted, regardless of the context. So someone might say something like, what's the best qualitative data analysis software, period, without context being considered in the question. So in our first book, we really wanted to counter this view of technological determinism. Without really thinking about it, we did so. We implicitly, though, also adopted a different theory of technology, one that positions technology, not humans, as passive and value neutral. Within this viewpoint, researchers are conceptualized as retaining control of the software, as an example, and the software doesn't control the study. So technology is positioned then as merely instrumental and might even be positioned as what a human researcher can use to create a more, in theory, rigorous study or set of findings, because the technology itself is presumed to be neutral and exists solely to serve us as researchers. So this view is one that allows us to enact certain strategies using software tactics, but ultimately, it's up to us to plan for how to use technology. And in many ways, this is an optimistic view of technology, one wherein humans retain control of innovations, and they're always the ones, we as researchers in this perspective are the ones that are always deciding whether to use digital tools or not to use them. So that was the position we took up in our first book. And a short while after we published our first book, I ran across a book entitled Researching a Post-Human World, Interviews with Digital Objects. And this book was written by Catherine Adams and Terry Lynn Thompson. Their book makes visible how research practices and ways of being in the world are increasingly intermingled, intertwined with digital technologies. And many of the insights they offer are situated in new materialistic and post-humanistic thinking, a perspective, as I'm sure many of you know, has really been coming into view in the field of qualitative research. So a few chapters into reading this book, I came across a reference to our book, and I thought, yay, they referenced our book. I read further. It was a very strong critique of our instrumental view of technology. And one of their main arguments was that we said reflexivity is important, but we didn't illustrate this in the book. And then fundamentally, they really just called us out on our instrumental view of technology use. So this critique was the impetus for us to really rethink and engage more deeply around theorization of technologies. And this pushed us forward as we began to write our new book. And also, we didn't know at the time how important this would become in 2020, wherein now so many of us are living in and through technology. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how in our new book, we take up a really particular stance to thinking about theorizing technology, one that's different from what we implicitly took up in our 2014 book. So in this new edition, we take up this stance that new technologies neither require particular changes in practice, which would be technological determinism, but neither is a given technology a neutral tool with no influence at all, which would be the instrumental view, the view we took up in our 2014 book. So it is neither, and it is both. From individual researchers retaining agency over the use of their digital tools, to the mutual shaping of tools and the research practice, to an investigation of how those with power are influencing how particular tools and practices are constructed and adopted. What is given is that the relationship between our digital tools and our qualitative research practices, or as Adams and Thompson called digital confluences, What's given is that we must carefully consider them. We must engage in a critical appraisal of them. But a central question here is how? How do we as qualitative researchers engage in this careful critical appraisal? So through intentionally attending to the perspectives, attitudes, and beliefs that shape research design decisions and meaning making, we can do this, including the use of technology. And we suggest that this making sense or careful consideration really does require going beyond a focus on digital tools to creating a strong theoretical foundation to help explain their intersections with the social world. One of my favorite quotes that I think captures the kind of work that we need to do as qualitative researchers is from a piece that Trena and her colleagues, Jackson and Davison, wrote in 2017, and I quote them here. They argue that these explorations should also take us beyond specific tools into new theoretical territory. These are questions we may only begin to ask if we engage in forms of reflexivity that push beyond simplistic opinions about the broad influence of technology in our work, as though it is monolithic, or the specific technological tools we use, as though they are fixed. So, as one example of this, of a researcher engaging in this theoretical territory, this critical appraisal, we share here on the screen a vignette from our new book. And just to offer context, across the book, we have over 40 vignettes included, and these vignettes are written by researchers in the field doing the work that we present in the book. These are real examples of considering the use of digital tools and spaces in light of their methodological choices and research stances. So here we share a short extract from a vignette in our book that was written by Professor Karen Woland, and Professor Woland is a literacy scholar at Indiana University. Here she's discussing her qualitative research on play and early childhood literacies, and is illustrating how new technologies have brought with them new theories and also invited us to really think about leveraging old theories in new ways. So in this vignette, Professor Woland illustrates how a materialist lens sheds new light on the study of play via video recorded data, and she highlights the ways in which a human-centered epistemology may ultimately result in overlooking relevant embodied and material interactions. So this work, she wrote in the vignette, requires digital tools to capture and analyze children's physical activities and the surrounding material environment. And she suggests in the vignette that to understand how we attach meanings to actions with things, it was really useful in her work to draw upon multimodal theory and materialistic theory. And she used these theories as checks on one another as a way of, these are her words, unmasking assumptions and uncovering the theoretical slant embedded in tools and their histories of uses. So this for us is just one example of how we as qualitative researchers and more collectively as the qualitative community can in really generative ways think with theory, not just when conceptualizing how substantive theories might shape our work, but also envisioning how technologies central in and to our work can be leveraged. So when we first begin to think with theories of technology at the intersection of qualitative research, we begin to think about how do we actually start? And we pose this question to all of you as well. How do we begin this kind of reflexive conversation with digital tools and spaces as co-researchers? So when they are positioned as co-researchers, how do we begin? So one of the ways that we've done this, at the end of every chapter in our book, we pose questions to help us as qualitative researchers get there. These questions are informed by Adams and Thompson, the book that I noted earlier as offering a critique of our 2014 work. And these are questions that we're offering to you all today as well. So to dive in deeper into this, Trena's going to walk us through what it might mean for us to engage in a critical appraisal of technology and qualitative research, and invite us to envision our work with digital tools and spaces as always already being entangled and embedded and really engaged in the research process with us as co-researchers. Trena?
Thanks, Jessica. So for today's presentation, we're framing this idea of reflexive engagement with digital workflows as critical appraisal questions. And these are by no means the only questions that are important to ask, but they're just a few to give you a flavor of what we think is important and what has been important. So our context for this is just one of many research technologies that exist in the world, but we thought that most appropriate for today's audience, of course, is qualitative data analysis software. For years, the CAQDAS Networking Project has been the go-to hub for learning more about software through their reviews, signing up for their trainings, and engaging with this large community of researchers. In this first critical appraisal question, we've also chosen one particular aspect of the research process to reflect upon and appraise, and that's the idea of handling research data. Even though we've emphasized in both books how important it is to think about the use of technology across the research process from the very beginning of the study, rather than waiting until data is in hand to figure out whether or not to use software, we do realize that this is exactly what most people do. And in fact, acknowledging this reality is part of holding a reflexive position when it comes to the relationship between methodology and technology. So we're starting here with a critical appraisal related to research data, and we ask, how does the use of software invite, discourage, scaffold, and/or frame the way that research data is handled in a study? By working through this question, we can start to critically appraise what happens when software becomes part of the digital workflow. So being more specific about what we mean, or in this example of handling research data, let's talk about handling data collaboratively, working together with data on a research team. This is a very real part of many people's digital workflow today. And we're very excited that Daniel Turner of Qualitative is going to be presenting a webinar as part of this series on the topic of collaborative analysis. So in our experience, in terms of collaborative data analysis, software can actually discourage collaboration. The CAQDAS platforms historically have not spoken to each other. This was especially true before the launch of the RefiQDA XML exchange. For most of our experiences with software, if you analyzed or handled a set of data in MaxQDA, for example, you could not open it and continue working in vivo. So this discouraged collaborative teams from working together if software was prioritized. This great leap forward of having the XML exchange could shift this landscape. Software companies that are participating in the exchange do invite a new way of handling research data, making it easier and supporting the collaboration. Of course, this is going to depend on how complicated and straightforward this exchange process proves to be. Another development that could shift this landscape of basically historically software discouraging collaborative working with data is to offer cloud-based versions of the software. In this Deduce, Quirkos Cloud, and Atlas for the Cloud have moved in this direction. So these are examples of ways that the software changes the workflow in a very relevant methodological way that needs serious reflexive attention. Let's look at another example of the way that software actually invites a particular way of handling research data. So we suggest that software invites the use of larger data sets than we could ever tackle by hand. The ability of some software packages to, for example, directly extract and import some forms of social media data, organize it by variables of interest, and autocode for keywords. This invites a new type of research data into the world of qualitative research. QDA software can scaffold and frame the very way that this data is handled in important ways. This, of course, has not gone unnoticed by qualitative researchers, though this invitation by the software to the researcher to do these new work with these new types of data has not always been accepted. This leads us to our next critical appraisal set of questions. Social media data has presented all researchers, especially qualitative ones, with a methodological dilemma. We cannot ignore this layer of human interaction because so many of us are communicating via social media and other online platforms, but it's so vast and unwieldy that our traditional methods are really not suited for it. So how can software solve these dilemmas? In what ways would humans and the material artifacts come together to do this? And how is this coming together going to alter our methods? So we were also excited to see that Stu Schulman of Discover Text is going to also be part of this webinar series and talk about how humans and machines can think and learn together, because indeed humans and machines are entangled in this process. As our world continues to change, our tools change and our methods change. Methods are always entangled, as Jessica pointed out, in historical moments. For us today in 2020, this is not only the COVID moment that we are in, but the social media infiltrated world that we are living in. And personally, ever since the late 1990s, I have been trying to figure out how to make sense as a qualitative researcher in a deep contextual way of the seemingly endless conversations in various types of social media. So back then, it wasn't called social media, of course. Basically, we were working with asynchronous discussion forums or maybe blogs in the higher education context in which I was doing my research. In fact, it was a large corpus of educational blog posts that motivated me to adopt Atlas TI. I hoped that it could solve my methodological dilemma of what to do with these conversations as a data source. So I invited Ricardo Contreras to the University of Tennessee to train my research team, and the rest is history. I adopted the software, and I'm now a trainer for that particular platform. Back then, though, I was far from understanding the complexity of what was actually happening as I began to integrate this software into my workflow. Atlas and the blog posts were material actors. Myself, my team, including Jessica at the time, Ricardo, and the Atlas TI team were the human actors, and together this entanglement really did transform my entire research practice. It even launched us into an entire methodological debate as to whether or not conversation analysis methods, which were originally developed for in-person and telephone conversations, could even be used to analyze online talk. Some in the field emphatically said, and probably still do say, no, they can't. But over the years, the convergence of these new forms of talk, new forms of technology, and new researchers have indeed come together to create what is basically a new methodological landscape, made possible by, yet also constrained by, the software. So this is my own example of the dynamic, messy, entangled process of theorizing technology use as part of a digital workflow in a more reflexive way. Our next set of questions has to do with change. Not only to people, because many of us working in this area just want to say, get on board already, please adopt the tools, stop complaining about it. And we implied as much ourselves in the first book, chiding people who were wary as being deterministic thinkers and just not open to the power of technology. But we need changes to the technology itself, especially when we think about ideal digital workflows. My own ideal digital workflow includes software that looks and functions exactly the same, whether my students and I are on Macs or PCs, allows us to work together in the cloud, and supports transcription in a very specific way. I'm going to use the qualitative research practice of transcription in conjunction with qualitative data analysis software to illustrate this need for change on the part of humans and on the part of software. Transcribing may be the most universally embraced practice in the qualitative world. Recording and transcribing interviews, focus groups, naturally occurring conversations, classroom talk, medical interactions, these are all very familiar to us. One of my biggest aha moments when we were writing the first book, as somebody who actually does not do a lot of transcribing because I work with social media data, I realized that there's software that will synchronize the recording with the transcribed version of the event. Even several different types of transcribed versions of the event if you're working with a tool like Transana. And David Woods will also be sharing more about this transcription process in a webinar later in the series. And I promise Christina did not pay me to put all of these plugs in. We just did notice that what we wanted to talk about today synchronizes really nicely with some of the other upcoming webinars. So the ideal digital workflow for me includes the ability to synchronize transcripts, but not all software packages support this, and some that used to support it don't anymore. So either I would need to change my expectations and workflow by adopting a tool that will do it, or the tool needs to change. But since our first book, this isn't even the main issue around transcription anymore, because transcription practices have moved into an entirely new realm, using artificial intelligence to automatically or automagically generate an initial draft of a transcript that can then be edited. So I would want to integrate this feature into my ideal workflow. By having the synchronized media file, have the media file of the recording synchronized with an automatically generated transcript that I could then refine for my purposes. So changes all around are needed. Changes may be needed by humans because while a lot of people are pretty ecstatic about these developments in the transcription world, not everyone is. Transcription is an analytic act and is a construction, which is what David Woods will be speaking about, no matter how you choose to do it. Some people feel strongly that manual transcription is an essential step in the research process. They feel that something is lost when the tools disrupt this process. As we know, the actual event that we were recording for research purposes is gone. There's no way to get it back. What we have is the recorded event, which now can even be analyzed directly without a transcript, with humans using software directly analyzing the recordings, or maybe someday AI will do a first pass of that analysis, and or by transcribing using a variety of tools involving humans or not, and then synchronized back with the recording or not. So some changes are needed by the software and by the humans to generate this ideal workflow, whatever that might be. And so thinking through what this workflow should be for your study and how to do that is the point of our book. So our final set of critical appraisal questions is where we're going to get really dark, figuratively and literally speaking, which seems appropriate for 2020 and the morning after our first presidential debate here in the States. We move now to the ethical and political consequences of our choices as researchers. So let's think about these really cool, fun, helpful tools that probably most of you are familiar with. TikTok is that cool video sharing app that gives us fun dance challenges to do with our families while we're all stuck inside during quarantine months. Facebook and Twitter and Instagram are places where we never have to keep our high school friends or family members wondering what we are up to. And Zoom is that tool that kept us all in work meetings and in class during the darkest days of the pandemic. Yet, at the same time, we also have America's current president attempting to block TikTok from the country. Facebook and Twitter have played a nefarious role in past and upcoming elections. And Zoom bombers have hacked into university classes to launch racist attacks. Tools are not neutral. They are not under our control. They are not merely instruments. Our decisions as researchers have serious consequences, especially now. But how political can adopting qualitative data analysis software really be? And we do make a point in both books that most, if not all, software packages were grassroots efforts developed from the ground up by researchers for researchers. This implies that these companies are good guys and not just greedy corporate actors. They're being inclusive and they're thinking first of researcher needs. However, at the same time, as we all rush to figure out how to move our social science research methods online, given the pandemic, let's not forget the simple fact that 1.3 billion people do not even have electricity, and that was in 2012 and amounted to just shy of 20% of the global population. This precludes many of our assumptions that by using digital tools and engaging in digital spaces, that we are expanding our reach, improving access to participants, and embracing the future. So our critical appraisal has to ask who is being excluded and who is being included by these moves. In terms of data analysis software, people with electricity and access to computers are included. Oops, sorry, clicked that too fast. Students and academics and nonprofits are included with institutional or discounted licenses. People without money to buy the software, without access to training, are excluded, including people at my own university. And lately I've begun to joke that my mission in life is to move to new universities to convince them to adopt qualitative data analysis software. I'm now on my third campaign over the course of my career. Yes, there are free and open source options if you're techie enough to have programming skills or resilient enough to be chill when the program disappears, neither of which are characteristics I typically ascribe to qualitative researchers. Now, in 2016, Quirkos posted on their blog about these accessibility issues, along with offering a less expensive version of the software to people working in particular lower income countries, and we commend this move. And we also want to acknowledge Nigel Fielding's many writings around what it means to do research with people and not on them, how to support the efforts of citizen scientists, and how mobile devices are making new types of research possible. So, in addition to qualitative data analysis software, there are many more examples of digital tools and spaces that need to be critically appraised while integrating them into a digital research workflow. And we talk about all of these in the book. What we're talking about today is really just one small part of the book. The book mostly focuses on, indeed, introducing to you and highlighting new tools and new spaces that you might be interested in knowing about and integrating into your practice. However, as practical as we do feel the book is, we do find ourselves thinking more and more often about some additional questions, which is, how do we move forward as social science researchers in this historical moment in ethical, consequential, meaningful ways without uncritically jumping to accepting technology as the solution? Do we know who these tools and spaces are privileging? Do we know who they're making vulnerable? While we agree, for example, that the ability to do interviews in Zoom is exciting, disability studies scholars such as Kirschbaum and Price have argued that while some researchers have thought carefully about the significance of such methods, a normative body-mind is still central in most portrayals of the online interview context. We must complicate by engaging in theorizing the implications of working at the intersection of qualitative research and digital spaces and tools. Of course, we're still fans of technology, but not without attending to this dialectical relationship between tools, humans, methodological practice, and the social world. So in closing, just to move back to the book itself, we'd like to just give you a little sneak preview of the content. As Jessica mentioned, we feel that one of the strengths of the book are stories from on-the-ground researchers who have struggled with methodological entanglements like the ones we've shared today. In chapters 1 through 3, we cover collaboration and reflection practices and the use of technology, qualitative research design, and the relationship of methodology and technology, and treating QDA software as a hub for your study. Now, these are just a few of the vignettes in case any of the contributing scholars are watching the webinar. I didn't have space to include everybody's vignette, but these are just sort of a sample of the topics that you'll encounter in each of these chapters. In chapters 4 to 6, we share tips for creating an entirely paperless literature review process. And we distinguish between pre-existing digital spaces as a data source and the use of digital tools to generate data. And finally, in chapters 7 to 9, we cover innovations in transcribing practices, ways to think about managing and analyzing data, and how to engage in writing and representing findings in ways that can support being a networked public scholar. None of these practices are neutral, obvious, inevitable, or inconsequential. And our hope is that today we've given you some ways to critically appraise your development of a digital research workflow. Thank you so much for the chance to talk through some of these ideas, and we hope that this sparks conversations and debates with all of us in this community who care about the intersection of research and technology.
Thank you so very, very much to both Trena and Jessica for what was an excellent start to this webinar series. I really greatly enjoyed that paper. Thank you very much, both of you. We now have a little bit of time for some questions, and we've had some questions through from the attendees here. So thank you so much for engaging in that way. As Christina said, if we're not able to answer all of the questions posed at the moment, we will endeavour to put them to both Trena and Jessica and to have them answered in the recording that comes with the webinar, which will be posted on a YouTube channel, which will send the link out through. So I'm going to some of the questions that have come through just now. I'd like to start with a question from Brittany. How do we deal with racism or anti-Blackness or bias in the digital world when it comes to our research. And Brittany's adding some examples into that here. So, for example, not capturing some accents or slang in our speech, or recognizing Black faces as easily. So that's a question from Brittany there. Trena or Jessica, who of you would like to address that? And I'm happy to read it out again.
I can start and then let Jessica add her thoughts on this. Yeah, absolutely. The first step is being aware that we do need to think about that and address that, especially like you said, we know now that video cameras and spaces like Zoom are not recognizing faces of color and Black faces. So we need to factor that into our choice to use that. It is as part of a digital research workflow, and demand and talk with companies about how they can basically correct that mistake on their part. Knowing, I'm just addressing your two specific examples of that question, knowing that transcription is an analytic act and that we are making choices about how we represent speech or what we heard, and working together with that community about how they would like their words represented would be a huge step. And that's part of our argument, you know, or what we've been thinking a lot about is doing research with people and not on them. And so if you are working with members of the Black community, they need to be part of the research team in some way, because as a white researcher, I won't even know what all of these issues are. It's not my lived experience, and it's my responsibility to work with people in order to understand what those issues are and help find solutions. Jessica, do you have some additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would just add that depending on your research focus, I mean, there is a body of kind of emergent scholarship that is focusing on the ways in which Black communities are turning to social media spaces to do anti-racist work. So that is one kind of different pathway forward of thinking about how to reframe what's happening in that space and to orient your attention to the space where anti-racist work is unfolding, whether it's noted or not by social science researchers is perhaps a different story, but thinking about ways that we can really foreground and make sense of the utility of that kind of space as well as the dangers, I think points to this both end and kind of layered aspects of doing this kind of qualitative work.
Okay, thank you very much both for that. Thank you. Another question we have here is from an anonymous poster. To what extent are researchers, reviewers, and journal editors willing to recognize the value of directly analyzing qualitative data without transcription? How can we decenter the dominance of language to recognize the value of direct analysis in qualitative data analysis?
I can get us started on this, and then Trena, if you have anything to add. Well, I mean, I think a big part of it is the pointing to the importance of us as a qualitative research community, assuring that we engage in methodological writing and thinking around this very issue. So the more we articulate the utility of this and we put that out in the world, we can move forward a conversation that could potentially impact reviewers, researchers, and journal editors. As I always tell my students, we are the ones that are crafting methodologies and methods as we go. It is a community-driven practice. And so this is a particular issue that I think is really front and center for a lot of us that work with video or audio-based data. I will say that I have several students who have recently worked with, in a qualitative sense, larger video-based data sets, and they did engage with direct memoing, direct coding, and selective transcription, and that work has been published. And what I'll say that they did well was they articulated in great detail the purpose for the move that they made at the level of method to move directly to working with audio and video data versus jumping quickly to transcribing. And the argument that often is kind of centered there is this idea that you actually can stay really close to the context where the data is being produced versus moving really quickly to transcribing, which of course it's often faster for many of us to read than it is for us to listen or view data. And so that argument is one that you can really point to kind of the depth of your understanding of the data if you do actually engage in this direct engagement with an audio or video file. But like I said, I think that a great deal of this centers on us as a community, making sure that we think about how these new technologies and ways of thinking about things like human language should shape methodology, and that means that we have to do some work to articulate what it means in practice. Trena, anything to add there?
No, that was great. And, you know, I'm facing this dilemma myself now with a ton of video recordings of doctor-patient interactions that I don't think we need to transcribe fully, but I'm thinking through methodologically what that's going to look like. So I think it's a really timely question because we do have tools now that can help us do that.
Great, thank you very much for that. We have another few moments. So we have a question here from Scott, who has asked, do you have any suggestions for educational researchers studying virtual K5 classrooms and the ethics involved in that?
You know, it's funny. Let me just repeat back because it got the sound got a little garbled there. The ethics of studying virtual K5 classrooms, like elementary level. Is that?
That's okay. Correct. Yes.
You know, Jessica and I have had some conversations around the pandemic and research and the difficulty, not just of the ethics of who we're studying, but the ethics of which researchers are actually able to continue their research right now and who is not, and how tough that is. And I think keeping in mind that everyone is suffering and struggling right now, and it is difficult to think about ethical ways of moving into these spaces. However, what I'm just going to fall back on and let Jessica add some of her own experience in here is that it's all about doing research with people and not on them. Is there some K5 environment out there that wants to work with you to help them understand what's happening during this time and can work to help you design, they will work with you to design an ethical, appropriate, reasonable plan to do research. I think as much as this entire pandemic experience has changed me as an educator and a researcher, I feel now more than ever how vulnerable everyone is, and treating people as research subjects and trying to get as much research generated as possible and take advantage of the COVID moment for research is really hard. It's something I've really struggled with. Jessica, do you want to add some thoughts here?
Yeah, I'll just add, if you're not already familiar with the Association of Internet Researchers and their ethics committee, you can Google that, and the ethics committee has a report that they update every couple of years. And in that report, they have a list of really helpful ethical questions with absolutely no answers, which is how ethics goes. But what those questions really offer us is to think through the sticky aspects, like the things that aren't just procedural, the things that don't just go through our ethics board and we go, check, I'm done with that, but that really raise kind of the sticky gray ethical concerns that digital spaces often present us with. And so those particular questions are questions that I really like to sit with when I am envisioning engaging in research in a new digital space, and recognize again that I won't necessarily have the answers to those questions, but those are important considerations. I also would just suggest that you know, if you are engaging in a K5 classroom, one of the questions that I'm hearing more and more from my education-based graduate students is how to navigate this, what feels like a new phenomenon of collecting data in spaces where some folks have consented and assented if they're young children, and yet other people begin to navigate this space and become part of that virtual observation. So for instance, like a young sibling is suddenly part of the virtual classroom and yet they haven't consented. So I know that particular issue is one that not just education researchers, but researchers that have transitioned some of their work to these online spaces are starting to think through of what does it mean when folks that haven't consented to participate are suddenly part of the observation that I'm engaged in when I see them on the screen. And again, I don't think there are clear answers, but I do think it's important that we think through those questions and also, whenever possible, turn to our participants to make sense of those stickier ethical moves. What should we do next?
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Thank you. We have a question from Steve, a series of questions that sort of lead on from each other. Steve asks whether you feel that we're seeing a land grab by quantitative researchers who are sort of talking about the kind of working with the big data side of things, counting words. So whether in this space of working with digital tools, we're seeing a land grab by quantitative researchers, whether we're seeing a ceding of ground by qualitative researchers who are determined to use tools to do the same things, but with a smaller data sets and not claiming to generalize. So talking around the kind of ebbs and flows of the quantitative and the qualitative world with regards to digital tools.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just had a book come out last year with Routledge on looking for insight, transformation and learning in online talk, which actually speaks exactly to this issue. I wrote it with a quantitative researcher, Alyssa Wise, and we talked a little bit about how computational methods, quantitative methods, and qualitative methods really need to be working in concert with each other to really understand what's going on in social media spaces. We can't have one without the other. I would argue, and as someone who's done qualitative analysis of social media for a really long time, I don't think I know I can't move forward anymore doing that in the same way, where I just sort of pick the most 100 recent posts and do a very deep dive without first being informed through some of these more powerful computational methods and quantitative methods of where the action is. There's action going on in these spaces that we can't really see as qualitative researchers in as robust of ways as computational scholars can. And so if we can work together on that, I think that's going to really be sort of the ideal digital workflow. How many of us have enough colleagues? You know, I think part of it's establishing relationships so we can have a research team with all of those voices. But to get to the original question, yes, I think that if you look at studies on Twitter, they're all quantitative. I mean, it's all using these tools to really be able to look across massive data sets and say some things that are different from what qualitative researchers say. But they can't answer all of the why and how questions that we can. But if we're just looking at a tiny little slice without really always a great reason why we choose the data we do, we're also sort of equally only limited in what we can say.
Thank you for that. Excellent. Nina, did you want, Jessica, did you want to add anything onto that?
No, I don't. That was great.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you so much again, Trena and Jessica, for this really excellent and thought-provoking presentation. It's really kicked off the seminar series very strongly, and thank you also for the engaging questions from all the attendees present. We were not able to answer all of the questions in this question and answer session, but as mentioned earlier, there will be some answers specifically to a few more of the kind of subject point questions around free analytic centers that Shelley posted, and Susan also posted around a reference that was of interest. So we'll share the answers to those in the recording, by the recording of the webinar in the YouTube channel. Just to close, looking ahead to the rest of the planned webinars in our series, as Trena mentioned earlier on, thank you, Trena, 3 of those webinars will look deeper at some of the issues raised today. So Trena spoke about both collaboration and the work on exchange formats between software, and indeed Daniel Turner's webinar is going to turn to that. The intersection between humans and machines is also going to be picked up by Stu Schulman's webinar, and David Woods' webinar will be exploring the act of transcription accomplished by humans and machines together. It promises to be a really exciting rest of the series. We also have a webinar by Nancy Muriaki, who will talk about teaching methods and tools together. Please join us for those. Thank you so much for being here today, and we wish you all a good, happy and healthy rest of the week. Thank you very much.